Today is May 13th, 2023. I want to talk about the ongoing conflict in Ukraine. I want to start by taking a look at the map. This is liveuamap.com. It is a pro-Ukrainian live map, so please keep that in mind as we look at it. As we can see, the line of contact remains more or less stable. A lot of fighting continues in the Donbas region, around Avdiivka, outside of Donetsk city, and of course in the city of Bakhmut, where Ukrainian forces are clinging to the westernmost part of the city. And as you can see on this pro-Ukrainian map, there is no indication that any sort of major Ukrainian counterattack took place. As a matter of fact, the only thing that the live map, pro-Ukrainian live map, showed that indicated anything of the sort might have happened was a note that the head of Wagner, Prigozhin, had said so, and that was it. It was not indicated on the map in terms of territory changing hands. We could also see strikes far behind Russian lines. We see explosions. They could be terrorist bombings. They could be long-range ordnance. We've heard about the British sending the Storm Shadow cruise missile to Ukraine. This isn't something that they're just sending to Ukraine now. This is something they've been planning to do for months. Russia knew that they were going to be doing this for months. So the idea that this is going to catch Russia off guard is very unlikely. And this first potential target that could have been hit was supposedly a factory in Lugansk city, and apparently there was a politician who was injured. There were no military units there. There was no military equipment there, not that I have heard of, reported in the attack. So I'm going to get into the Storm Shadow here a little bit later, but I want to get back into this situation around Bakhmut. We have this article from the BBC. This is from today, May 13th. Ukraine claims gains in Bakhmut after Russia denials. And it says, Ukraine says it has recaptured ground in Bakhmut, a rare advance after months of grinding Russian gains in the eastern city. Kiev said its forces advanced 2 kilometers in a week. Russia said its troops had regrouped in one area. Claims signal a momentum shift in Bakhmut, but more widely, there is no clear evidence of a Ukrainian counteroffensive. Well, a counteroffensive in Bakhmut carried out by Ukrainian forces is not necessarily an indication of a much wider overall offensive launched by Ukrainian forces. This is what we have seen all throughout this conflict and throughout all sorts of conflicts in recent history. When there is heavy fighting in an urban environment, you're going to see territory change hands very rapidly, sometimes several times in a day, sometimes several times in a week. That is not a sign of momentum shifting. You have to zoom out, say a week or a month, and see what the vector sum of territory trading hands looks like, to whom. And if we zoom out and we look at Bakhmut, it's very clear Russia is taking the city of Bakhmut. There is no evidence that there is any sort of momentum shift. Far too many people, including on the pro-Russian side, are obsessed with tactical minutia. This is something analysts, a military man, Andrei Martyanov, I'll put a link to his YouTube channel in the video description below. Very interesting discussions that he has on his channel. He warns against the obsession with tactical minutia, the obsession with looking at the battlefield hour by hour or even minute by minute. The problem is that even people on the ground at a particular point along the line of contact, they're not even seeing clearly what is happening there, let alone the big picture along the entire line of contact. Having been in the military myself, never in combat, but even in training, You're on the ground. You only see a very limited view of what's taking place. Your understanding of what you're seeing is very limited. And unless you have information from higher up, it's very hard to put a complete picture together. And when you take these incomplete bits of information and you piece them together, as the Russian military blogosphere does, you can get a very distorted picture of what's going on the line of contact. And that's what happened over the last couple of days. There was hysteria. The hysteria was feeding itself, and what you got was a propaganda storm, not launched by Ukraine and their spin doctors, but launched by pro-Russian media channels themselves. And this isn't the first time that they've done that. So I would urge caution against obsessing over tactical minutia. Some people really enjoy digging into this. I have no interest in it in terms of entertainment. I want to know what's going on, and I want to relay that information to other people. And digging into tactical minutia is a very inaccurate way of figuring out what is going on. People need to be patient. The vector sum of whatever is happening is eventually going to reveal itself, and you will see official statements from the senior levels of military leadership on both sides, and you will be able to put together their narratives and make a composite that is somewhere in the middle where the truth most likely resides. Ukraine will launch its offensive whenever it's going to launch its offensive. And when it does, we will most likely know about it. Just as was the case last year in the fall. That offensive was supposed to be in the spring and summer, and then it was postponed until eventually it was launched in the fall. In Kharkov, the offensive was launched very intensely and immediately, and it was a hard push into Russian-held territory. And that was because there were hardly any Russian forces fighting in the Kharkov region. They had already been withdrawn weeks ahead of time. Ukrainian forces continued taking territory until they actually reached the first large groupings of organized and determined Russian forces in that area. And then in Kherson, what we saw was reconnaissance in force, and then we saw wave after wave of attempts to overwhelm Russian defenses. And that was not working. There was no major breakthrough. And then eventually Russia decided to withdraw to the east side of the Dnieper River. Until then, we just saw these waves and waves. There was no single large offensive. There were these waves attempting to overwhelm Russian defenses and compel Russian forces to withdraw. So it's very reasonable to believe that something similar to these scenarios is going to play out again whenever Ukraine launches its offensive. They said spring offensive. Now it's looking like spring-summer offensive. It could be postponed until the fall or even later. No one knows. There's so many reasons why the offensive could be postponed. It could be because Ukraine simply hasn't gotten ready in time. It could be because Russia is disrupting those preparations with this campaign of strikes all across Ukraine. I'm going to talk about that in just a moment. It could be the weather. It could be any number of reasons, but they most certainly will launch some kind of offensive. It's going to happen. Where it happens, when it happens, we won't know until it happens. Let's talk a little bit more about what's going on around Bakhmut. Like I said, there could be an offensive launched by Ukraine completely independent of the much larger offensive that it's planning. We've seen smaller counterattacks, I guess you could call them, rather than a counteroffensive. Counterattacks launched by Ukrainian troops. Sometimes it's to free up a logistics route that they need, that Russia had recently taken. I was asked, why is it that Russia fights so hard and so long to take a position from Ukraine, and then it seems like Ukraine can take that position right back? Well, because Ukrainian forces had weeks, months, sometimes years to fortify these positions. Russia has to fight very hard to dislodge Ukrainian troops from these positions. Then Russia has to consolidate control over them, fortify them, before they're able to hold them as persistently as Ukrainian troops had. And if a counterattack is launched before that happens, then it'll be very easy to dislodge these Russian troops. And likewise, if Ukraine gets a hold of this territory again, then they need to consolidate control over it, refortify it. And if a Russian counterattack happens before they're able to do that, the territory will change hands yet again. And that's what we have seen in Severodonetsk and Lysychansk. That's what we saw in Mariupol. And that's what we're seeing right now in Bakhmut. That is how this type of warfare unfolds. And obsessing with the block by block unfolding of this conflict is not how you're going to get an accurate picture of the overall fighting and a clear picture of who is succeeding and who is not. Again, I would highly suggest people watch some of the work by Andrei Martyanov. He does an excellent job explaining the way actual military planners think, how strategists think, and how they focus on factors that are entirely different than we see ordinary people focusing on, the obsession with tactical minutia and territorial control. He is looking at a much larger picture, and if you go through his videos, you're going to start catching on to what these actually important factors are versus the superficial factors a lot of people think are important. Now, one more thing I want to say about Bakhmut before I talk about some other things. I am seeing yet more evidence that Ukraine is using some of its absolute best equipment in and around Bakhmut, in the fighting there. Now, a few updates ago, I was talking about the American M109 self-propelled howitzer, how that was seen fighting in and around Bakhmut. And I said at the time that I thought Ukraine would have reserved these for their offensive, wherever that offensive would unfold. And I speculated that perhaps it's there because they plan on launching an offensive there in and around Bakhmut. Or maybe it's because Russia really is pulling in the best troops and equipment of Ukraine in Bakhmut. That was what the operation was designed for. It was not necessarily designed to take the city of Bakhmut. It was designed to set the stage in one specific area, to draw in Ukrainian troops and their equipment, and then to grind it down and destroy it all. They have their Lancet drones, for example. These Lancet drone units concentrated in and around Bakhmut, hunting these artillery systems that Ukraine is bringing in, including the M109. And now I just saw a video from Scribs News. This was from May 3rd, 2023. Inside Ukraine, the most powerful artillery gun in the world. They're talking about the German-made PZH 2000. And it's very similar to the M109. It's a self-propelled howitzer, 155 millimeters, and they're using this around Bakhmut. And in the video, they talk about how they narrowly escaped one of these Russian drone attacks. Because again, Russia is able to concentrate these Lancet units in and around Bakhmut. This is where they're pulling in Ukrainian forces, and this is where they can concentrate assets like that and maximize the amount of heavy equipment that they can destroy. So they narrowly escaped an attack by a Russian drone. And then also in the video, they show footage of Ukrainian troops fighting on the ground. So they were showing this self-propelled howitzer operating, and then they showed ground troops benefiting from the cover, the support, the artillery support this is providing. And you can see the Nazi Wolf's Angle logo as the watermark on the video, because this was an Azov Nazi military unit. And I just thought that that was interesting because, as I pointed out, it's very difficult for the Western media to do any sort of video report on Ukraine and show Ukrainian troops fighting in the field without catching Nazis on camera. There's a huge problem with Nazis in Ukraine. There has been since 2014, since literal Nazis were included in the government then, and then they were kind of quietly moved out of the government but into the military. And the government, despite not being openly Nazis, they arm and they fund and they help equip Nazi military formations officially included in the Ukrainian armed forces. I think that's a very important point to keep in mind. And when we see things like this, it vindicates Russia's justification for being in Ukraine. They said they're in there partly to denazify Ukraine. There's obviously a Nazi problem when Scripps News is trying to make the Ukrainian troops look heroic, and they still manage to, I would assume, accidentally show literal Nazis running around on the battlefield fighting for Kiev, the regime in Kiev. Now let's talk about the actual Ukrainian offensive. For the offensive itself, we're waiting for the actual Ukrainian offensive to begin. We're seeing a lot of long-range strikes being carried out by both sides. So for Russia's part, they're carrying out long-range strikes using cruise missiles, ballistic missiles, drones, military aviation. They're hitting all kinds of targets, troop concentrations, warehouses filled with equipment, arms depots. We're seeing these huge explosions when they hit these depots where they're keeping all of this ammunition, command centers, and all of this is being done to actually physically disrupt the upcoming offensive. And then Ukraine, on the other hand, are carrying out attacks that are much more political in nature. These don't really have any chance of disrupting Russia's military effort, but it does have a potential to shape the battlefield psychologically and in terms of information space. We saw a long-range attack in Lugansk city. Now, I'm hearing conflicting reports regarding this attack, and I'm going to take this from TASS. This is Russian state media. This is what Russia is saying, or saying what they believe happened in Lugansk city. These articles are all dated May 13th, 2023. The first article says, fragments of an American decoy missile ADM-160 found in central Lugansk agency. The rocket is capable of flying a distance of up to 900 kilometers. Parts of this missile were found in central Lugansk. There was a polymer manufacturing plant that was struck. This is the headline from TASS. Ukraine struck polymer manufacturing plant in Lugansk, former LPR envoy. And then the third article is strike on Lugansk delivered from Olka multiple missile launchers. The Olka multiple missile launchers, well, this is very similar to Russia's Tornado S. It is a guided multiple launch rocket system. It has a range of up to 120 kilometers, which is actually further than the HIMARS. If that is what Ukraine was using, they do not have a lot of these. They don't have the means to create additional launchers for munitions. But again, if this is some sort of shaping operation psychologically or strategically, they're going to use absolutely everything that they have on hand, including systems that they have a very small number of. I'm also hearing that it could potentially have been one of these Storm Shadow cruise missiles that the UK transferred to Ukraine. But what does the presence of this ADM-160 decoy missile mean? This was not a system that was specifically mentioned in any of the US military assistance packages given to Ukraine. However, if you go to these Ukraine fact sheets made available by the Pentagon, after each assistance package is announced and the list made public, they also release something like this, which shows absolutely everything that they've given to Ukraine up to a certain date. So this is everything the US has given to Ukraine up to May 9th, 2023. And if you look down the list, you will see a very ambiguous phrase, counter air defense capability. Counter air defense capability. Well, this decoy missile certainly qualifies as a counter air defense capability. It's meant to counter the air defense of Russia. It's meant to trick the air defense system into thinking an aircraft is approaching. Russian air defense operators will switch their radars on to engage, and then an anti-radiation missile can then be launched at these radars that are now switched on, and it could home in on those radar signatures and destroy them. What this ADM-160 was doing in Lugansk, I have no idea. We have to wait for those details to come out. So that ADM-160 is a counter air defense capability, and it was most likely sent to Ukraine months ago. It's an air-launched system, just like the Storm Shadow cruise missile is, and so this was most likely part of some sort of suppression of enemy air defense or SEAD operations that they were carrying out. How effective they are, I have no idea. We've heard about these HARM missiles, these high-speed anti-radiation missiles that the U.S. have been providing Ukraine. I've not heard any success stories at all about them, and I think that if they were having success, we would have never heard the end of it. Let's talk more about the Storm Shadow. So this is from CNN. Britain has delivered long-range Storm Shadow cruise missiles to Ukraine ahead of expected counteroffensive, sources say. Well, if there's any hope at all for the Storm Shadow cruise missiles to be used in the counteroffensive, they would have had to have been sent months ago, and they would have had to have been adapting the Soviet-era aircraft that Ukraine has to launch them. These are also air-launched missiles. The article says the Storm Shadow is a long-range cruise missile with stealth capabilities jointly developed by the UK and France, which is typically launched from the air. With a firing range in excess of 250 kilometers or 155 miles, it is just short of the 185-mile range capability of the US-made surface-to-surface Army Tactical Missile Systems, or ATACMS, that Ukraine has long asked for. The missile is a real game changer from a range perspective, a senior U.S. military official told CNN, and gives Kiev a capability it has been requesting since the onset of the war. As CNN has reported, Ukraine's current maximum range on U.S.-provided weapons is around 49 miles. Well, a game changer. We've heard all of this before. The difference between the ATACMS and the Storm Shadow cruise missile is not only that the ATACMS travels further, has a longer range, but it's ground launched. So you can use ground-based platforms to launch it, mobile platforms that you could move around, you can conceal them easily, and it's as easy as operating a truck, because that's all it is. It's a truck that is serving as the launch platform for the ATACMS. For the Storm Shadow cruise missile, you need to launch it using an aircraft. So you need all of the capabilities to operate an aircraft, to maintain it on the ground, to launch it into the air. You have to get past not only Russian air defense systems, but also Russian military aviation, which is capable of detecting Ukrainian warplanes from Russian airspace and using very long-range air-to-air missiles to take them out. And then the missile itself has to somehow circumvent Russian air defense systems, electronic warfare, such as GPS jamming, and then it still has to hit its target. When you think about all of these things that have to go right, it seems like this is not going to be an extremely effective weapon, but inevitably missiles will get through, just like with HIMARS and Excalibur guided artillery shells. They will get through, they will do damage, they will create vignette victories, a vignette of a victory, but strategically they are not going to change anything, because Ukraine is going to rely on its incredibly small air force to launch these. And for all of the reasons that I just said, Russia is not defenseless against these missiles, and this is not a capability that Russia doesn't have or exceed, and does so in great abundance. So if it's a war-winning capability, Russia has it and more, and then Russia will clearly win before Ukraine does with these Storm Shadow cruise missiles. And surely Russian military planners considered the possibility that longer-range weapons would be handed over to Ukraine, especially after the HIMARS was handed over to Ukraine. They should have had contingencies in place for dealing with things like the ATACMS and the Storm Shadow, which had been talked about for months and months. So anything that is absolutely critical would need to be moved back at least 250 to 300 kilometers. That seems like pretty far, but then consider that everything critical for Ukraine that it absolutely cannot afford to lose has to be put in Poland, 1,000 kilometers or more from the line of contact. And so Russia would still have the advantage there. And then anything that had to be close to the line of contact, well, they'll just have to invest more time in concealing it, hardening it, and dispersing whatever these things are, arms depots, logistics centers, disperse them, spread them out. And then it's not going to be a very good trade-off for Ukraine to risk a warplane, launch one of these missiles that they'll have in limited numbers just to hit a very small logistics point because Russia has dispersed them across the front. Another aspect regarding the Storm Shadow missile is that it's pre-programmed before launch. It has a specific point on the map, again, GPS guided. It also does something called terrain mapping. It's going to know what it's looking at in terms of terrain right before it's hugging the terrain like most cruise missiles do at a low altitude, and before it strikes it'll increase its altitude, and then it'll actually be looking on the ground for its target using cameras. And in order to do this, Ukraine almost certainly will need high quality satellite intelligence, which they themselves are not capable of acquiring. So they're going to have to work with the US and the UK when picking these targets. So again, the US and the UK at a minimum are a party to this war. They are complicit in any one of these Shadow Storm cruise missile strikes, as they have been in other long-range attacks where they almost are certainly supplying intelligence to Ukraine to carry out these strikes. I will continue keeping an eye on all of this. Again, we're still waiting for the Ukrainian offensive to unfold. It could happen gradually. It could happen all at once. It could be a combination of the two at different points along the line of contact. We simply don't know. We have to wait and see. People have to be patient, and most importantly, they have to be calm. Ukraine is fighting a war of territorial conquest, while Russia is fighting and winning a war of attrition. Ukraine most likely is going to take territory during its offensive. And if it doesn't, it will be an absolute blunder and failure. But they most likely will take territory. They could even take a lot of territory. The point is, no matter where they end on the map in terms of their offensive, they will be a depleted force, incapable of restoring their fighting capacity. They will be unable to weather Russia's continued grinding war of attrition that they have been doing and that they said they will continue doing after they weather this offensive. So that's very important to keep in mind. Ukraine and their Western sponsors are almost openly saying that they're actually depending on some sort of psychological element being at play, overwhelming Russian troops, the rank and file on the battlefields, the military and political leadership in Russia, Russian society, and across the media, the Russian media included. They're hoping to overwhelm them with panic and cause a psychological break where tactically and strategically Russia should be able to hold. So they're banking entirely on that, and their success actually rests entirely in the hands of Russian troops, their commanders, Russia's political leadership, and of course the Russian media itself. It's discipline or lack thereof to resist allowing panic and hysteria to take root and grow in favor of Ukrainian military objectives. If you thought this video was useful, please like and share. Think about subscribing. It's free to do. It helps the channel grow. Check the video description below for other places you can find and follow my work, as well as all the links that I referenced in this video. Also in the video description are ways you can help support my work. I don't monetize my YouTube channel. If an ad pops up, feel free to skip it because it's not helping me out at all. If you do want to help support my work, please do so through Buy Me a Coffee and also Patreon. The links to both of them and other options will be in the video description below. To everyone who has been helping out, thank you so much. And that includes people who are simply sharing my work with others, getting the word out to other people. That is what makes this work so effective. So thank you so much. And as always, thank you for watching.